All right, recording is in progress. I hope you stay with us with your cameras, but if you don't want your camera on record, you can go ahead and turn it off. That's fine. It's more fun to stay with us though, so I hope you do. This is week 5 of Welty at Home. We are discussing volume 3, chapters 5 through 10 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. If your book isn't divided into volumes, that would be chapters 47 to 52. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by our moderators once again, Susan Allen Ford, Professor Emerita of Delta State University and editor of Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal, and Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and Professor Emerita at Millsaps College. To comment or ask a question, click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select the raise hand function. And I'll be helping everyone watch that. Also, keep an eye on the chat. I've already placed a link, one link. I want to see if you can see it. This is to Henry's Townhouse. So for all of you who are planning your trips to London to go see where Lydia has escaped to, where Jane Austen runs around, or where Elizabeth Bennet is running around, you can. Here's one of many places you can stay. This was sent to us by Mary Weaver. It's fun to poke around. Before we got online, we were talking about different places to stay in London. So Suzanne and Dr. Mars are good resources for that. That said, I'm going to turn it over to them to start today's discussion.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome. As you remember, last time we were spending most of our discussion at Pemberley, where we had Elizabeth and Darcy moving closer together, and we have a sense that they have both changed and they're both working hard at this. And they're also both surprised to see each other, and Elizabeth is certainly surprised to see the change in Darcy. And we also saw Bingley and got a sense that he is still actually in love with Jane, though not there, or she's not there to kind of work with that. And then just as things seem to be moving on to a happy conclusion, we have one more impediment with the news that Lydia has eloped with Wickham. And we didn't get a chance to start talking about that last time. And Suzanne was saying we must start with the Lydia situation and Elizabeth and Darcy's discussion around that. So I want to do that, and I think this whole section that we're talking about really is all about the Lydia Wickham situation and how people respond to it, what it tells us about the characters, what it tells us about the consequence of the Bennet family dynamics, and we're looking at how people respond to this crisis. And Austen is really putting this world together, or her world back together. She's bringing in all these characters we might not have thought about for a while. So I guess—
Susan, are you ready for me to put the link on? Would you like me to share the Where's Wickham link?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So before everybody jumps in to talk, I'm going to want us to start maybe with the Darcy and Elizabeth discussion of the letters from Jane. But what Jessica is putting up now is an article by Sue Ford from Persuasions Online called Where's Wickham? Suzanne was interested to know where in London is all this happening. And so that article has lots of maps. As well.
If you ever come to, if we're ever in London together, we're going to walk through all these places.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, so I guess we want to start by thinking about the 2 letters from Jane that come first of all, and everybody's response. Elizabeth's response to those 2 letters from Jane. What we see about Jane, of course, and Darcy's response, and how they are working through this new information, to put it without any emotion on it. These would be in, oh, I've lost my chapter sheet, but the last two chapters, that would be chapter 4, I guess, of this. I mean, this is, while you're kind of thinking, these are the first 2 of a bunch of letters that we get
Mhm.
in this section. I counted up this morning, 2 from Jane, 1 from Lydia, 1 from Mr. Collins, 2 from Mr. Gardner, 1 from Elizabeth, and 1 from Mrs. Gardner. So in this brief period, that's what, 8 letters in this section of the novel. That's a lot of correspondence.
I was really interested in the fact that Elizabeth talks openly with Darcy about these letters, and she's sort of caught off guard. But before this, we've had him give her a letter that tells her about his sister and Wickham, and he's confided in her. Now she's confiding in him, and it seems to be preparing us for the kind of relationship they will have, which is a much more open and a relationship where they do consult each other, probably will consult each other in the future, although he tries to keep his help secret. But ultimately, then she realizes that they are so well suited to each other. And I think it's set in contrast to the marriage of her parents. So those things interested me.
Yeah, who are even throughout this whole period just very separated, living in different parts of the house,
Right.
not talking at all except when they're at the dinner table. Yeah, Monica.
So I have a question.
Hmm.
When she's talking to Darcy's fixed in astonishment, and he says, when I consider that I might have prevented it, I who knew what he was, had I but explained some part of it only, some part of what I learned to my own family. Darcy isn't going to go around and spread the word that his sister almost eloped with Wickham. What could have could there have been actually any sort of appropriate thing that he could have done that wouldn't have, put his sister in a terrible light?
Yeah, aren't those words you just quoted Elizabeth's? She could have done something?
No, it's the end of let's see.
I think they both say essentially
Yeah,
the same
right.
thing.
He says something like that.
It's my page 264, and it's Darcy was fixed in. Oh, this is she.
Yeah,
Darcy was fixed in astonishment.
right, but he does say something like that later, when
Right.
he's explaining to the Gardners why he wants to take charge here.
But so she couldn't have told anybody. I mean, he told her in a letter, but she isn't going to go around telling his business to people.
Yeah, I don't think either of them had too much leeway with this.
I mean, she tried with her dad. She tried telling her father, look, Lydia's behavior is out of control. You've got to do
Right.
something. That's about as much as she could have done, right?
Yeah, and and I guess her thought is she could have said, Wickham is not the guy we think, he's but how could she provide evidence for that? I mean, I think that's the real problem there. There's no evidence.
That's what she does do with the Gardners finally, and they want the evidence, but they do believe her,
Yeah, but they also know that there's something between her and Darcy, so they're willing to kind of suspend inquiry. But she some evidence at that point. She says, well, remember what Wickham told us about Miss Darcy? Well, that's not true. So, she's able to deal more with it. But yeah, I don't really know that there's a lot that either of them could have done. Beverly?
I was going to comment on what you said about the parents living separate lives, more or less. And in chapter 19, there's at the beginning of that chapter, there's a lot about Mr. Bennett and his lack of interest in and affection for his wife, that I think I had missed that in the beginning. I've read this book before, but he's respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever. That he had no real affection for her anymore. All his views of domestic happiness were overthrown, but Mr. Bennett was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment of his own impudence had brought on and any of these pleasures. He's fond of the country and books. And so it made me a little more sympathetic to Miss Bennett, which I have a hard time being sympathetic to her because she's so all over the place all the time and hysterical most of the time. But if you lived with a man who was so dismissive of you, and we've seen him be dismissive of her, and he was dismissive of the girls, and later on he takes responsibility for what happened with Lydia, and I did not like him. And when I was reading that, and I felt more sympathy for Miss Bennett than I normally do.
Yeah, it's really a bad family dynamic. And there's that thing back, I think, where you're looking, where Elizabeth thinks about how her father really exposed her mother to to her children, so that they didn't respect her either because of the way that he didn't respect her. So I think in my early readings of this novel, I felt that I really liked Mr. Bennett because he was so witty and funny, and has this way of skewering people, or as Mrs. Bennett says, giving them one of his set downs. But the more you look at him and the more you kind of think about his effect on the family as a whole, the more he becomes problematic. And I think we can see Elizabeth at the early part of the novel moving in that direction, right? Her aunt cautions her not to become cynical, and she does, and that, follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. Well, we enjoy that, but if that's all she's doing, and I think that's a problem, and that's one of the things she seems to have learned at this stage.
In Mr. Bennett's defense, I will say, after Lydia elopes, he does take responsibility, as his wife does not. She'll blame everyone but herself. He blames himself. So
yeah, although he says, "Don't worry, it's not going to last that long."
right, yeah. I think Harriet has something.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm talking. Oh, am I on here? I'm
Yes.
talking about the same scenes. I think I see it differently than Suzanne right now. That is, I'm thinking about the way in which Austen is equivocal about both of these parents. I was thinking about Monica's sense of sympathy for Mrs. Bennet, and as awful as Mrs. Bennet is, when she hears that Lydia is getting married and she is worried about the clothes, and applying to Mr. Bennet for money for the clothing, she also makes the point, ultimately, there's a practical side to her. She makes the point that if they don't receive them with provided clothes for the wedding, that it's going to damage Lydia. And Mr. Bennett's reaction that they'll never be received in this house is something that she understands both is not what she wants, and there's the silly side of her, or the indulgent side of her, to Lydia, but at the same time, there's recognition and understanding of the social situation and of the need to make this wedding look as normal as possible for Lydia's sake.
But the wedding is in London. Nobody from Barrington.
Well, no, it's the reception, the reception of them when they come back. Point taken, the wedding's in London. But when Mr. Bennett says they're not coming back to this house ever, Mrs. Bennett understands that that's not a good plan.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's Jane and Elizabeth who have to help convince him, right? And they are able to move him. I mean, there's that line about how they were so rational and thoughtful. Where did that go? 297. It says, Jane and this is at the end of chapter 8 or chapter 50. But Jane and Elizabeth, who agreed in wishing for the sake of their sister's feelings and consequence that she should be noticed on her marriage by her parents, urged him so earnestly, yet so rationally and so mildly to receive her and her husband at Longbourn as soon as they were married, that he was prevailed on to think as they thought and act as they wish. So there we have, you know, them being actually able to move Mr. Bennett. I kind of, you know, agree that what we see here, I mean, at least partly, is Mrs. Bennett's understanding of how things look. You know, now she's missing a lot of that too, of how things look, and it doesn't seem to bother her too much. Since there's a wedding, let's go with that. But I mean, certainly it's to the family's advantage to, you know, recognize this marriage, you know, as if it were a normal one.
I think that's Cheryl there with the.
Yeah, that's Cheryl. Cheryl?
Yeah, it's me. Can you hear me? I'm headed home, but
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I'll be able to pull up the reference soon, but Lydia infuriates me. I'm like, she makes me furious. Maybe like as a parent and because I'm one of 4 children. And you do have to think about how your actions, to an extent, you know, you can't live your life for someone else, but you have to think about how your actions reflect upon your family. However, Jane Austen makes it a point, at least twice in the text, to say she has this through Lizzie's voice, that Lydia was never taught.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of parental instruction, that's another of Jane Austen's finger pointing moments. Like, look at this, you are supposed to instruct your children how to behave. And Mrs. Bennett's tunnel vision, right? So initially it's, I have to get these girls married. I have to get them married, right? To Lydia's elopement, and she's staying in bed and she's depressed, and she's not even thinking about how this is going to affect her other 4 daughters' chances of being married. So that's what makes me mad about Mrs. Bennett's reaction to the elopement.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that is true. And she, I mean, she is blaming in that passage everybody for herself. She blames Wickham, she blames Mr. Bennett, you know, she blames all these different people. And the narrator really points to her, you know, as this person who has indulged her daughter. Joellen?
At first, I was just going to comment, make a distinction regarding what the point Harriet was making, that it would hardly matter what people in Meryton thought, because the community enters again, and Wickham's name is blackened, he's vilified, everyone thinks this, everyone thinks this.
Yeah.
So that I was saying, well, Mrs. Bennet may have been thinking about them going on to the north. But then I realized that probably part of Mrs. Bennet's practicality is that she knows exactly how long the community's opinion will last, and that it would flip right back once they see Lydia back and being introduced all around. So anyway, that was just, there were a couple of things that occurred to me there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's true. And I mean, think about what Mr. Collins tells us that Lady Catherine says, who she condescendingly observes will want to ally themselves with such a family. You know, I mean, and it's not just Lady Catherine. I mean, Elizabeth has thought the same. You know, everybody is I mean, if we go back to that chapter that we started on, I mean, there's so much language of shock and horror, and you know, it's one of the worst things that could possibly happen to a family of girls, you know, to have one of the sisters do this. And it's going to be something that they're going to have a hard time, if ever, getting over. It looks like
one of the most shocking lines in Collins' letter is when he says, it would be better if she had died.
Yeah,
To be compromised.
the death of your daughter would be a blessing in comparison. Yeah. Yes, he's not the kind of person you want to have as your parish priest, I think.
This Monica, I think, had something.
Yeah.
No, I was going to point out Collins's line, and what it's interesting to see what everybody, you know, you noted that we have a lot of letters in this section, and they seem to be, I don't know what everybody's role is. I mean, you talked at the beginning about seeing how everybody either reacts or what part they play in this. And I don't know what Collins's letter's point is, other than just to like go ha ha at them and say, better your daughter's dead. Boy, I sure am glad I you know, missed. I could have been more directly connected to y'all. Sure did, you know, glad your daughter turned me down. But yeah, Collins's letter is just appalling to me. And you see, I guess, I mean, what is his purpose there? Does he think he's being an advisor of some ecclesiastical sort there?
I think less of an advisor and more a judge, right? I mean, and Charlotte tells me she's always been indulged. So it is your fault, but you know, on the other side, she must have been naturally bad, or she wouldn't have done this so early in her life.
And
So,
I mean, there's that, and it's an interesting coupled with that brief little thing that Mary says to Elizabeth when Elizabeth gets home, that she's like, well, you know, this just goes to show, you know, the moral lessons we should be, although it's odd that Mary's actually being a better ecclesiastical guide than Collins is.
well, she might be a little smarter. She thinks she is anyway. But I mean, I think one of the things that this does is bring back the whole notion of the conduct literature that we had before with Fordyce and with Darcy and Elizabeth talking about education early in the novel. We're really seeing here the limits of that kind of instruction, as well as the limits of no instruction. You know, they're both kind of coming together here. Marion?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind us that Darcy really started all this with his aspersions to the family. I mean, he already has set this thing in motion with Elizabeth by saying, you know, I hate to tell you, but, you know, your family is not doing right.
Yeah.
So that started the whole ball rolling. It was a wonderful foreshadowing that's come into fruition now.
Yeah, and just at the moment when she has some relatives she wants to introduce to him, you know, so I mean, she's all kind of excited that here are the gardeners, and she's not blushing for them, and they're behaving well, and he's enjoying them and inviting Mr. Gardner to fish and all that kind of stuff. And then what happens? You know, in a much worse way than anyone had ever anticipated, Lydia sort of proves the problem with the family. I mean, she talks, there was a phrase I wrote down this morning, a family so deranged. And I it's like that is a wonderful phrase to get at what's going on here. Joellen.
I was just going to comment on Monica's question about Collins's purpose. And I think that his purpose doesn't go too deeply, but I think Austen's purpose was probably to let him represent yet another community. And you mentioned the conduct literature, but the clergy, and we've seen in earlier sections where in the same way as Mrs. Bennet understanding the mob of the town mentality, he really does reflect what clerical opinion would often be in these situations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's also just a kind of piling on, and I think that's another thing that we're getting in this section. I mean, over comes Lady Lucas to talk about this. Mr. Collins has heard about this from the Lucases, and Charlotte throws in her 2 cents apparently about the bad upbringing, and Lady Catherine and Anne have something to say, I mean, and all of Meryton is in on this. I mean, it's just everybody. And I think you just get a sense there's no way out of this. Jacob.
I was going to add, I like the phrase you just said, that the piling up that's occurring at this point in the novel. I think that same kind of concept applies to Jane Austen here. I mean, just listening to the discussion over the weeks, how much this story that's generally seen as a very romantic novel has a kind of ghoulish quality to it at times, where it can be pretty dark, pretty serious. The stakes are high. And I just hear kind of Austen's genius and her ability to pile up a series of events and emotions and ideas that almost seem to threaten the genre that she's working within, right? The romance, the comedy, the marriage plot. She's almost trying to, like, how much can I fright this genre with pretty serious stuff that can almost deconstruct it or break it. And there are moments where we feel that we're kind of at the moment where, can she break the plot? Is this going to be an unhappy story? And I just wanted to admire what I think she's doing here. She's really doing a lot.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it could well be that it breaks the plot, because in most novels of this period, Lydia would go off and live in another, well, they say another country, but they really mean another county, another part of the country, another part of England, and maybe under even an assumed name, and kind of live out her life in penitence and solitude. And the rest of them, might end up with, one of the clerks of Mr. Phillips or something like that. I mean, everybody's getting ready to fall out of their class here. Now, I mean, there are some novelists like Charlotte Smith, who often in her novels takes somebody who has fallen sexually and lets them get married or lets them marry again and, live a kind of happier life. And she doesn't kind of condemn them to, everlasting penitence, but that's unusual. So, yeah, I mean, Austen is I love your idea of breaking the plot, because I think that's about what's, what could happen or could have happened. Marion? Oh, you're muted.
What about this going to Scotland? Does it have more significance than just they saw him headed that way? But it keeps coming up. They might have gone to Scotland. They might have gone to Scotland.
Gretna Green was the place you would go to get married if you didn't have parental permission. So it's right over the border in Scotland. And then there are you know, there are a couple of places in London that you can do that too. I think that Sue Forg in that essay that we've given you the link to might talk about that, but there's something in the note in the back of this Penguin text too, that certain parishes allow someone who's lived, you know, who's been resident there for 3 weeks to marry without parental permission. So that's it. So the fact that, I mean, 3 weeks is a long time to be living in sin, right? So, you know, the fact that they didn't go to Scotland right away tells against them. Yeah, Monica?
You know, your comparison to other contemporary stories, I hadn't thought about it this way before, but Lydia completely does not learn any lesson. She is not repentant at all. And even, I was struck reading it this time at the very end of chapter 8/50, when they hear back that, okay, the uncle's got it taken care of and everything. And Mrs. Bennet says, you know, there are several young men too that she'll see there that she likes very much. So that to me, when Mrs. Bennet's like, oh, and there's all those young men that she likes there. So even as a married woman, she's going to go around flirting with all of the officers still.
Yeah.
And certainly her behavior towards her family is just, oh, so terrible. But yeah, I hadn't thought about, she does not learn a single thing, which is also kind of, you know, fun and refreshing about this story, that we can have, you know, the almost nearly ruined young woman who does not learn anything from her adventures.
Yeah, Lydia was Lydia still, is the sentence I like there. Well, yeah, I mean, I thought it was really funny. This time I was noticing how, yeah, she not only does she not learn any lessons, but she's the person who's interrupted Mr. Collins is reading a Fordyce sermons before. Well, here Mrs. Gardner has been preaching to her while she's getting dressed, and you know, she says, well, if she heard one word, I'm surprised, because she didn't pay a bit of attention. And Lydia says, well, yeah, she was preaching, but I didn't listen to her. I was thinking about what my dear Wickham would wear and whether he'd be married in his blue coat. You know, so I mean, it's really comic. And yet, going back to what Jacob was saying, it has those darker aspects of, you know, to it as well. Cheryl.
I have a question, a quick question and then a comment, but I was wondering when it became common in literature to use names as a symbol. So like Wickham is wicked, and the Hearst sisters, like they're hurtful. I don't know if that was a thing that was being done in English literature at the time intentionally, or if it's something creative that Jane Austen came up with. And then we also were discussing family relationships, like how an aunt and Jane Austen cared very much for all of her nieces and nephews throughout her life. And but sisters are also discussed. So when the Gardners and Lizzie are talking about Lydia, Lizzie doesn't want to say too much because of a sister's decency, that a sister's sense of decency and virtue in such a point. But then this is also where she says that Lydia has never been taught to think on serious subjects, and she has been given up to nothing but amusement and vanity. She has been allowed to dispose of her time. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, that is such an interesting theme of this section, but it also kind of takes us back earlier to when Lady Catherine has been saying, what, you didn't have a governess, 5 daughters without a governess? And, you know, Elizabeth sort of says, oh, well, you know, we were always encouraged to read, and those of us who wanted to learn certainly could, and those of us who wanted to be idle could too. At that stage, it doesn't seem like she really sees that as a problem. But now, I mean, she's coming back, so that we're even getting a sense that maybe Lady Catherine has a point, you know, to make. We can't just dismiss her, you know, totally. In terms of that other question you asked about naming, I mean, I think that at least in English literature, naming of characters with significant names, I mean, we can think of it all the way back in the medieval morality plays, you know, where you have characters like Everyman and Faith and Good Deeds and that sort of thing. And it was less fashionable to do that so obviously at this period. I mean, people would have names that were significant, but the thing about the novel was that you want to have this illusion of realism or real life here. And so you don't want a name that just screams, I am a symbol, you know? So, I mean, I think that's why, well, now I can't even think of what would be a good example of a name that screams, I'm a symbol, but I think she's choosing names that might have some resonance, but she's also choosing names that are, you know, names that people would have. John. John?
You're muted, John.
John? Well, maybe we'll come back to that.
One thing I looked up just this morning was what in 1814 £1,000 would be worth today, and it was almost $100,000. So his debt is substantial.
Yeah.
Debt is substantial. That £1,000 is not to be sniffed at. Yeah.
No, and now I wish I could remember the numbers. I'm not good at that, but whatever each of those daughters are going to get, is it 500 or 100?
No, they're going to each get 1,000.
They're each going to get 1,000. Well,
Yeah.
that's their whole fortune,
Yeah.
you know, and their income from that would be 4% once they get it. So that's not a huge amount of money. So he's really spent. And the fact that he is, as Jane would say, a gamester, you know, suggests that this is going to be a problem in their larger relationship or in their larger marriage, because that's not the kind of thing you stop too easily. Cheryl?
So they cover his debts and then they give him another 1,000.
And they buy him a commission in the army, which then will come with income.
Yes.
So, and it gets him out of town. And that's the regular army rather than the militia. Cheryl.
This is also part of the monetary discussion is when Mr. Gardner, the letter, and but they also are, I'm trying to find it, but Jane Austen also explains that that Mr. Bennet had wanted to be more economical earlier in their marriage after he realized that they that they were not economical because they assumed that the son would be born, and that because the properties entailed to the male heir, that if Mr. Bennet precedes his wife in death, that the daughters would be taken care of through the male heir, but that doesn't happen. So he regrets later, after Lydia's born, just being the fifth child, not because she's Lydia, that he hadn't taken those steps to put together a retirement fund. And also, when he gets that final letter from Mr. Gardner explaining that things have been worked out, he leaves the house, he goes outside. And we were talking about that in our last meeting about being outside in the nature and how that gives you a different mindset. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. That passage you're talking about, you know, his failure to save, and the intention of breaking off the entail because of course they'd have a son, that comes in chapter 8, right at the beginning. And yeah, I mean, you realize that they just kind of kept thinking, oh, of course we'll have a son, of course we'll have a son. And so they just put off saving. The idea with the entail was you could break it, but you couldn't break it until you and the heir were both, well, the heir was of age, and you as the current owner, you know, still had the property, still had the title, but both of you had to agree to break off the entail. Well, that's not going to happen with Mr. Collins as the heir, because he wants the entail to work. Now, since, I mean, if Mr. Collins produces a son, then when the son would get to be, you know, of age, they could break the entail, and then, you know, the estate would be available to divide up in any way possible. That sort of got us off the track, I think, but sorry, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. I think we had Harriet and Miriam. Marion.
Marion, did you have something you wanted to? No? Harriet? Oh. Harriet, you are muted.
Am I unmuted now? I was only going to say what we've said about the £1,000 that is to pay back his debts, £1,000 to goes to him, and then the commission. I wondered how much a commission would cost. But but that's Darcy's money that has saved the day. Mr. Bennett actually comes out quite well, as he says. £100 is probably about what he already spends on Lydia and her frivolities, and so he's no more damaged than he was before.
Except he thinks he has to pay Mr. Gardner back at this stage, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, he is kind of looking at that. Although, and I think it's interesting that Mrs. Bennett says, well, you know, of course he's going to give us the money. If he didn't have children, who else would give it to? Well, he does have children.
Right.
Something like 4 or 5. So he's got a destination for that money. But anyway, I thought that was funny. There's an article in Persuasions Online, and I'll try to remember to get it for next week. But if you're interested beforehand, it's by Marilyn Frankus, Francus, and it's called something like Jane Austen Pound for Pound. And she puts out in a table all the incomes or all the fortunes for both the male characters and the female characters in all the novels. So you can really see how people, you know, are endowed. It's very interesting.
The other thing I've been thinking about is John Browning's comment last time that Austen anticipates the mystery novel and the country house mystery, and I'm just been noticing how much this section of the novel is written with the delay of information gradually seeping out as we are following with a developing mystery of where are they, who is handling it, how is it being handled, and the unfolding of that plot.
Darcy as detective here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. And And the fact that we're getting it through letters, I think helps.
Yes.
There,
Well, I think John is back up, maybe.
okay, John? John, are you there?
He put in the chat that he's having audio issues.
Okay, okay, and then Joe Ellen?
I was going to mention the letters again, those 8 letters, because we started dropping in bits of information that comes from Mr. Gardner's letters, and eventually we'll get to Mrs. Gardner's letter. And the use of the epistolary side of this really illustrates what Harriet was saying about when we learn, get information along with the characters. And I really started charting when it mattered that a conversation was in person and when it mattered that it was received by letter. And I didn't have time really to pull those thoughts together because I'm actually just outside London. I'm not sure where Wickham was, but I've been at Goodnestone, Godmersham, and in Hampshire, or in Hartford in the last couple of weeks. But anyway, the epistolary side of this is, I think this is the major section of the novel where Jane Austen is showing her stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, there's some theory. I mean, some people think that First Impressions started life as an epistolary novel, and that these are remnants. But I think that it really works in the ways that you and Harriet are suggesting, to have this material coming this way rather than having us keep shifting back to London,
And actually, I think this section also is absolutely about correcting first impressions.
Mhm.
There's just as a theme, the novel really would best be titled First Impressions through this section, I think.
Uh-huh. Mhm. Interesting. Okay,
John
John?
thinks he's back. Let's try again with John.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would, Cheryl's question about the names kind of having a parallel to the character,
Mhm.
like an allegory. If you look at the satiric novels and satiric writers like Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver is gullible, the Yahoos, all that sort of thing. She would have surely known that and
Mhm.
picked up on that sort of thing. So in part, she's writing, I think at the beginning of the novel, she's writing in a satiric vein, largely a novel of manners and satire on the social situation. So that kind of fits in. She keeps changing genre, like people have been saying, like the mystery part with Darcy looking for Lydia and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think she is using names purposely, and it's kind of in the tradition.
Mhm.
And there's always restoration drama, and there's Bunyan, and I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of it of the period,
Smollett, yeah. I mean, well, we were talking about Fielding last week with the country house, Squire Allworthy. I mean, there are lots of examples, but I think she does it in a more subtle way than those overtly satiric or overtly comic novelists do.
I've always wondered about Netherfield and the name. And that name.
Okay, well, I'll let you talk about that if you're.
I don't have the answer.
John, are you still? Do you have another thing to say? Your hand is still up.
I'll put my hand down now.
Oh, okay. Let's see, there was something I was thinking about. Oh, I know what was occurring to me is thinking about Lydia and thinking about Mrs. Bennet and the way in which Austen really seems to be showing us the beginning of this marriage as being, as moving on to have the same kind of consequences as the the Bennett marriage. Let's see, where was I looking? Now I can't find it. Well, it's when
It's when Wickham and Lydia come home, right? And she's saying that Jane and Elizabeth felt for her probably more than she felt for herself.
that's not it, but that's an interesting one. You want to say some more about what happens in that scene, because we really haven't talked about it when they come back.
It's just part of the thing that makes me mad about Lydia's about their behavior, that they're not I think the word might be recalcitrant in any way. They're not apologetic, and the only ones who really feel understand. Of course, you can like forgive people when they do you harm, but they act as if they have done nothing to which they should be forgiven. And Lydia is just rambling on and on about how great the ceremony was, and Elizabeth could bear it no longer. She got up and ran out of the room and returned no more.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sense, and the word that is used for Mrs. Bennet's spirits is oppressive. And I think we see Elizabeth and Jane both feeling the same way about Lydia. And then with Wickham, I mean, he's just like he always was, which now Elizabeth sees as no limits to the impudence of an impudent man, but he's just so agreeable all over the place. But now she sees that agreeableness in, a much more suspicious, darker way. What I was looking for was in chapter 5 or chapter 47, about the second page in. This is on 269. Elizabeth says to her aunt and uncle, he cannot afford it. He's not going to marry a woman without money. And what claims has Lydia? What attractions has she beyond youth, health, and good humor? And I read that and I thought, that sounds familiar. And back in chapter 19 of volume 2, or chapter 42, Elizabeth's father, captivated by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. So we really are seeing these two marriages as kind of starting off on that same path. Yeah, Harriet?
Yeah, that raises the question of what it was that Wickham was trying for when he eloped with Lydia. I think I get the sense that that he was hoping for some money from Mr. Bennett to get Lydia back, and then he would marry for money elsewhere. Melissa in the chat has suggested the other thing that I consider, which is that he was targeting Mr. Darcy all along. This was a plot to have him defend the Bennets and to get what he owes. But that seems a little like Wickham would know too much. For that to be the case. So I wondered about that, and I'm just raising that as a question. And then the other thing I was thinking was about Elizabeth's relationship with Wickham in this chapter, as she handles him by saying enough to quiet him in the future on certain subjects, but at the same time is keeping the appearances of civility, which surprised me. And I'm just wondering about that passage as something to talk about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, she is kind of not violating any, propriety or anything, or any civility by just kind of keeping on this very careful level of discourse. The question you were asking about what Wickham had in mind, I get the sense that he just wanted to get out of Brighton because he had so many debts. And this was a way of getting out of Brighton, laying low, and Lydia was there and kind of anxious to come with him. And she doesn't seem to care too much about marriage or when they'll be married. She just thinks it'll happen eventually. So
I think, doesn't Elizabeth think he just didn't want to go alone?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it might be more fun, although I wonder if it'd be more fun to have Lydia with you all the time. Marcia?
There's something in the chapter about Lydia's return that actually is repeated almost exactly from Austen's earlier novel, Sense and Sensibility. And it's the part where Lydia is saying that she saw William Golding in a curricle, and I let down the side glass next to him and took off my glove and let my hand just rest upon the window frame so that he might see the ring. And then I bowed and smiled. The same thing, a very despicable person in Sense and Sensibility, a woman that we dislike from the moment we meet her, does the same thing to let people know that she has been married. I won't mention the name because it would be a spoiler for anyone who wants to read Sense and Sensibility. It's the only time I can remember Austen just literally using the same device of a showy, not misbehaved woman acting a certain way. And then the other thing about Lydia and her misbehaving, when she gets to the house, she boasts of being married to Mrs. Hill and the two housemaids. Mm-hmm. She goes to talk to the servants, and that, I mean, she's so full of herself and so full of her news that she's willing to just talk to anyone. Just a comment.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. I was noticing in this section how many times the servants are mentioned. We hadn't really paid too much attention to them earlier in the novel, but it's one of the things that Elizabeth, when she hears about what happened, thinks, I wonder if there was a servant in the house, who didn't know that this had happened, and they're trying to keep Bennett located to her room so that she can talk to Hill, who's the housekeeper, but the rest of the servants might be insulated from this news. And then when they're having dinner, and Mrs. Bennett is talking about which houses they could rent and all that kind of stuff, and in the neighborhood, and Mr. Bennett waits till the servants leave, and then he says, well, into one house in the neighborhood they will not enter. So I mean, we're really focused again on the news and the way in which they're trying to control the spread of this information. And I mean, the suggestion is really how impossible that might be. They're not going to be able to control it. And servants move. So, I mean, they're gonna, this is just gonna spread.
Well, we're at 12:59. Are there any closing thoughts?
I have one. It struck me that Elizabeth, or when Wickham pops up to talk to Elizabeth when she's walking, reading the letter from Mrs. Gardner, he says, I see I've interrupted your solitary ramble or something like that. And I thought, hey, that's the same scene that we've seen with, her running into Darcy on her solitary walk, or running into Fitzwilliam on the solitary walk. And now here she is running into Wickham. I don't know what to do with that. I just thought it was interesting.
Thank you so much. All right, well, next week on November 7th, we'll discuss volume 3, chapters 11 through 19, which would be 53 through 61, if you're not, into volumes. And that will be the final discussion of our series on Pride and Prejudice. So stay tuned for details on our next Welty at Home Book Club pick, which we will probably drop at the end of our next session on November 7th. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody. Thank
Bye.
you.